Hello students, I will be talking to you today about medieval political thought in India. Political thought, as you all know, is a response to a given situation, and that is why I will begin by telling you very briefly about the state, about society and religion that existed in India during these times. Let us first have a brief look at the timeline. The medieval period constitutes an important episode of Indian history because there were major contributions during this period in the domains of art, literature, culture, science and religion. This period lasted from the 8th to the 18th centuries and began to be identified in the 19th century itself as the Muslim period. The period from the 8th to the 13th centuries is generally dubbed as the early medieval period, and the period from the 13th to the 18th centuries is regarded as the late medieval period. And writings of the colonial period often try to contrast this period with what they claimed to be the rule of law, the period of the rule of law during British times, but as if to give the impression that there was lawlessness and chaos during medieval India, which is perhaps not the right way to look at it. Okay, and you will see very clearly that there were definitely moorings of a proper system of governance in medieval times. But India at this time was a fragmented polity. The period between the 8th and the 12th centuries in the political life of India was witness to the presence of a large number of states across India. The bigger ones tried to establish their supremacy in northern India and the Deccan. And in the southern part of the country, the most important ruling dynasty was that of the Cholas. This is the time when India comes into contact with Islam. In the 10th century, the Turks arose as a powerful force in Central and West Asia and carved out kingdoms for themselves. A subsequent series of invasions in the 12th and early 13th century culminated in the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate. The establishment of the Sultanate marked the beginning of a new phase in the history of medieval India. Politically led to the unification of northern India and parts of the Deccan for almost a century. And this is also the time when we come across the advent of the Mughals, who inaugurated one of the most glorious chapters in Indian history. The disintegration of the Delhi Sultanate resulted in the emergence of various regional powers. So when the Mughal Babur invaded India in 1526, the central power of the Sultanate had substantially weakened and there were a number of independent kingdoms. The Delhi and adjoining regions were under Sultan Ibrahim Lodi. Other important kingdoms included Gujarat, Malwa, Bengal, Bijapur, Golconda, Ahmednagar and others. It is in this political context that a new ruling dynasty made its way to India, the Mughals. The Mughals were led by the able military commander Babur, and his successors subsequently consolidated the gains of the Mughal emperors. The collapse of the Mughal Empire in the 18th century signified the end of the Mughal period in Indian history. So what was the state like during this time? It was basically a theocracy. The head of the state was also the religious head, and he was looked upon as the representative of God on earth, and therefore derived his position and authority from God. Thus, the Caliph was the supreme head of the whole Muslim world. Although the Sultans of Delhi professed formal allegiance to the Caliphate, the Sultanate was always an independent state for all practical purposes. Moreover, the political need and the ignorance of the sultans about the Shariat had resulted in a division of the functions of the state. The religious side was looked after by the ulemas, while the administrative side was looked upon by the sultan. Of course, we do not find any robust theory of kingship during medieval India. But kingship had no moral, religious or political basis. However, also in the time of the Mughals as well as in the time of the Delhi Sultanate, we find that the king was the fulcrum of the entire political system. And of course, Because it was dependent on this king, the administration under their authority often suffered from various ills. One encounters frequent episodes of mismanagement in governmental affairs, lack of discipline and order throughout the state. The masses were sometimes not loyal to their sultans and did not respect their status. But these people could not rebel openly, as they feared different kinds of sanctions and harsh punishments at the hands of the sultan, because the sultan was the repository of absolute coercive powers. So what was the political structure of the state? This was basically a dynastic monarchy. From 1210, when the Delhi Sultanate was formally founded, the sultans gathered more and more powers. It can be fairly stated that a sultan was generally a more powerful ruler than a Hindu ruler of earlier centuries. The process reached its climax under Alauddin Khilji, who effectively controlled the empire and ran it as if it were a village. Muhammad bin Tughlaq also went far in this regard, but he of course suffered a setback. We come across the views of Ziauddin Barani, who is one of the most eloquent exponents of the life and times of the Delhi Sultanate. He was a renowned scholar and a noted historian. His writings confirm what I said just a moment ago, that the king is the focal point of the entire Sultanate, and it is on his shoulders that the peace, order and stability of the realm and welfare and economic prosperity of the people depended. The king is requested to embrace Islamic Shariat from the core of his heart, and also to try to evolve his policies for peace and war in consultation with administrators, advisors and commanders. Even the rules and regulations regarding his officers and ministers should be decided upon after due consultation with the relevant men of knowledge and experience. The Mughals thereafter laid down the foundations of an empire. By the time the Mughal Empire was established, the power in the countryside was mostly in the hands of large and small Hindu family and kin groups. Caste cohesion and caste affinity among them had encouraged conditions in which members of a sub-caste lived close to each other in a cluster of villages known in Mughal India as the Pargana. The policy of their absorption into the Muslim state power was not begun by the Mughals. Since the time of the rule by the Tughlaqs, the Hindus began to figure in the state services. Sikandar Lodi, generally remembered for his bigotry, encouraged the Hindus to learn Persian in order to be able to take up responsibilities and high positions in the state. And in fact, the rise of Sher Khan Suri to power depended considerably on his ability to integrate the Rajputs into his army. But under the Mughals, this coordination was definitely reinforced. So what was the state in Mughal India all about? You see, what you have to note, and this is of great significance, is the fact that besides the enormous increase in the scale of coordination that I have just referred to, many of the local Hindu elites began to identify themselves to a certain degree not simply with the Mughal state system, but also with the Mughal Persian culture. The bedrock of a Mughal state or polity was thus founded in Mughal India in no uncertain way. Abul Fazl, one of the right-hand men of Akbar, comes up with very clear views about Mughal India, and we come across his views in his famous book Aini Akbari and Akbarnama. He likens the state to a body politic, to a living organism. Just as the balance or equilibrium in any living creature is contingent upon the balance among the four elements of fire, water, air and earth, similarly, the stability or equilibrium of a polity is dependent upon a judicious division of ranks, with each rank or segment contributing to the prosperity of the whole. Abul Fazl, therefore, we find, defines the state in the context of the needs of society, and he classifies individuals into various categories like workers, artificers, merchants, men of religion like the Brahmanas and the Ulemas and others. And all these individuals are said to constitute three classes or categories of men: noble, base and intermediate. The nobles possessed intellect, sagacity, administrative capacity, eloquence, and courage for military duty. The other two classes were self-centered. The laborers and husbandmen are relegated to the third or the lowest position. Abul Fazl's views, and this is important, reflected the prejudices of the contemporary upper classes. It implied that those belonging to the lower rungs of the social ladder could not aspire for a share in state power and administration. Fazl thus recommended a social division of labor and that each person should specialize in his allotted station in life. In Mughal India, we come across a clear separation between the church and the state. In fact, the Hindus constituted a considerable part of the administrative offices in the state and even occupied prominent and responsible positions. However, the recruitment, conditions of service, promotion, and all other aspects of engagement were dependent upon the Muslim monarch. Even the ulemas or the Muslim theologians were not consulted by the emperor in this regard. On the contrary, we find that it is the rulers who kept the ulemas under check. But please remember that the Mughal state was not a sacerdotal state. Although theoretically the Mughal state was underlined by the dictates of Islam, Mughal India was not a sacerdotal state steeped in Islamic orthodoxy. It was rather a state where real authority was vested in the omnipotent will of the rulers. The Mughal emperors were repositories of inalienable and ultimate sovereign power, and there was no institutionalized structure for legal and constitutional resistance against their professed will. They were at one and the same time the head of the military and the supreme commander of the armed forces, the head of the administrative apparatus of the state, the chief decision-making executive, the fountainhead of justice, as well as the supreme controller of finance and ultimate authority in all foreign and domestic matters. There was no conception of separation of powers. So the medieval state, if we can come down to some kind of a conclusion, is basically a theocratic military autocracy. Indeed, political theory that developed under Muslim rulers from 1206 to 1757 AD may be best described as a defense of theocratic military autocracy. But of course, you find that this theocracy was tempered with a healthy dose of tolerance and liberalism by such benevolent emperors like Akbar. Over with the state, we want now take a glimpse of the rural picture. When we look at the rural side in the times of Mughals, we find that the basic unit was the self-sufficient village community. Villages were defensive, self-contained units designed for survival even during periods of war and alien domination. They paid taxes to whoever held state power and were relatively unperturbed by the influx of foreign invaders and rulers. Conquerors of India found a ready source of income, so they had no incentive to destroy the system. Instead, they simply established themselves as a new and separate caste. The latter was the choice exercised both by the Muslims as well as by the British. The reason why the Mughals could in fact raise so much revenue from their taxation without having a ruling class which directly supervised the production process was that the village society was rather docile. And of course, India, as you know, has always been the land of the caste system, and we find that quite entrenched during medieval times in India. In each village, the dominant caste controlled the land through their property rights, and they were of course circumscribed. In general, land would not be transferred or sold to the people outside the village because land generally belonged to the village community, a very notable feature of Indian feudalism. Most villages belonged to the cultivating castes, with each family tending customarily, but equal shares of the land were possessed by them. Brahmins were not cultivators. They performed functions of local priesthood in alliance with the locally dominant caste and used low caste or untouchable laborers to cultivate their land. In each village, there were artisans who provided non-agricultural goods and services. In addition, there was a lower caste of untouchable village servants to perform the menial tasks. Of course, although I have mentioned that the self-sufficient village community was the basic unit across India during medieval times, there were differences and intra-village peculiarities, and these varied from place to place. They varied from place to place and changed over time according to the degree of outside fiscal pressure. But all over the country, the top group in the village were allies of the state and co-beneficiaries in the system of exploitation. In every village, as I mentioned, the bottom layer were the untouchables, and they were squeezed tight against the margin of subsistence. The extra-village exploitation was sanctioned by military force, intra-village exploitation by the caste system and its religious sanctions. Over to the urban side. In the urban areas, particularly at the center, which was the heart of the empire and where the imperial court loomed large, we come across a ruling class whose extravagant lifestyle surpassed even that of European aristocracy. It had an industrial sector producing luxury goods which Europe could not match, but this was achieved by subjecting the population to a high degree of exploitation. That was the seamy side of the lustre that loomed large in medieval India. Living standards of ordinary people were lower than those of European peasants, and their life expectation was shorter. The high degree of exploitation was possible because of the passivity, of the docility of the village society. The social mechanism which kept the villages passive also lowered productivity of labor and provided little incentive to technical progress of productive investment. But of course, Mughals have always been reputed for the grandeur. In fact, they are almost like equivalent terms. Mughal India had a good deal to impress the Western visitors. From the time of Akbar to Shah Jahan, the court was one of the most brilliant in the world. It was cosmopolitan and religiously tolerant. Literature and painting flourished, as did wonderful pieces of architecture. At the apex of social hierarchy at the center was the Mughal emperor himself. Below him were the Mansabdars, followed by the Jagirdars, and below the Jagirdars were the native princes and the Zamindars. Now we come to a brief glimpse of the sway of Islam in medieval India. The Sultanate theory of kingship viewed the ruler as intermediate between the messenger of God and the deputy of the Prophet on the one hand and the Umrah on the other. The Sultan's authority was conditional upon the satisfactory performance, that is, leader of the faithful, in defense and promotion of his faith. ABUL FAZL was, however, categorical that a ruler endowed with divine light need not function as an intermediary. The Badshah was a repository of absolute power, and people were duty-bound to obey his orders. Under Shah, the state partially emerged from the shackles of religious biases as the overwhelming, or at least the dominating, motivation of the ruler, inasmuch as a more liberal policy was adopted towards the Hindu subjects. But liberation from religious domination was far from complete, for the jizya continued to be levied. And of course, we find in Barani some of the most extreme views on religion. His Fatwa-i-Jahandari bears an undeniable impress of his extreme views on religion. The ideal of kingship in the Delhi Sultanate was largely influenced by Islamic ideas, whereby the rulers claimed to be representatives of God on earth. Barani recommends that a Muslim king should concentrate all his powers on holy wars and completely uproot all false creeds. He believed that a Muslim king should commit himself to the establishment of the supremacy of Islam in India and simultaneously annihilate the Brahmins. In fact, he suggested that a Muslim king ought to embrace a firm resolve to overpower, capture, enslave, and degrade the infidel. No wonder these views are extreme. And he was sometimes, in fact, a fanatical protagonist of Islam. We find that he says that as Hindus had enjoyed the monopoly of trade and commerce, he recommended that Hindu merchants and traders ought to be deprived of their wealth and assets. They could even be humiliated in society. Those like the Brahmans, who occupied the apex of the social hierarchy and enjoyed status and wealth, could even be robbed, and the wealth could be redistributed among the poverty-stricken Muslims. So how did FAZL interpret kingship? And we find in Abul Fazl definitely the foundations of a more secular thinking and a perfect contrast with the views of Barani that we have just seen. He impressed on Akbar the idea of king as an agent of God who worked on his behalf. Sovereignty was a divine light which gradually overwhelmed and eclipsed the traditional concept of the king as the shadow of God or Zillillahi. In order to realize the noble objectives of true kingship, it was necessary to combine both religious and secular authority in the same sovereign. So long as these two powers were kept separate, Fazl comments, there was strife and confusion among the children of Noah, meaning mankind. Under Akbar, the spiritual and temporal powers were sought to be combined. Fazl insists that the king should not discriminate against the subjects. The positive implications of this idea of kingship are brought about in the preface by Abul Fazl. In his wisdom, king will understand the spirit of the age and shape his conduct accordingly. Quite a flexible view, nothing rigid about it. He will not be fit for the royal dignity if he does regard all conditions of humanity and sects of religion with the single eye of favor. He should not be mother to some and stepmother to others. In fact, Fazl clarifies that if the emperor discriminated on the basis of caste, religion, class, etc., he could not be considered to be a good king. So Abul Fazl definitely emerges as a sworn enemy of religious orthodoxy. He was never a blind supporter of Islam. He was a votary of a composite culture and opined that the Hindus, like the Muslims, subscribed to the doctrine of monotheism. But Muslims often misunderstood them because of their ignorance of the Hindu scriptures. Unlike Barani, who in many of his views appeared as an almost fanatical protagonist of Islam, Abul Fazl never believed in the superiority of Islam over other religions. He was therefore often maligned as kafir. Abul Fazl has a secular orientation and endorsed equality and fraternity of all religions based on the doctrine of Suli Kul or universal peace. He was an intellectual who embraced Catholicism in outlook and was a sworn enemy of any kind of religious orthodoxy. And we find a clear reiteration of Fazl's views in the policy of religious toleration of Emperor Akbar. Of course, Sher Shah was the forerunner of Akbar in adopting the policy of religious toleration, but Akbar was undoubtedly the first monarch in medieval India who raised the policy of religious toleration to the level of a secular religion. The initial stirrings of his policy of religious toleration towards the Hindus manifested in the form of a spiritual awakening. He had fully imbibed the belief that all religions were equal. He not only believed in secularism, but also demonstrated his beliefs through practices both big and small, and the most notable amongst them all was his proclamation of Din Ilahi. The main objective of the Din Ilahi was to separate politics from religion and give importance to royal decree than that of orthodox Islamic laws. Akbar called himself Imam-e Adil, or the chief interpreter of Islamic law. In this way, Akbar developed an effective control over Diwani Qaza, or the judicial cum religious department, which was earlier dominated by the ulemas or Muslim theologians, who were always more sympathetic towards the Muslim community and expressed faith in the orthodox beliefs of Islam. It seems that by calling himself the Mujahid and a declaration of Majahar, Akbar made himself temporal as well as the spiritual leader. By founding Din-i-Ilahi, he was eager to weld all the Indians, irrespective of their caste, creed, religious belief and practices, into a homogeneous society. And herein lies the pragmatism and the benevolence at the same time of Emperor Akbar. And FAZL reiterated that there should be no rigid consensus on Islamic law. He addressed the basic question as to what constituted the Islamic order. And he was of the opinion that while the benchmark of the former was the enforcement of the laws of Islam, yet there was no rigid consensus on Islamic law. And the Quran, in fact, he insisted, was open to multiple interpretations, and there was no monolithic Shariat which would need to be upheld in all quarters across space and time. Laws were meant to govern human behavior in such a way that man remained on the Sirat al-Mustaqim, that is the straight path which leads to God. So whether an order was Islamic or not, according to FAZL, depended not on the enforcement of any particular law, but rather on whether the polity conformed to the essence, the spirit, the soul of Islam. So Mughal India is definitely a theocracy, but a theocracy with a difference. FAZL used religion to glorify and rationalize the ideological foundations of the Mughal state under Akbar by representing him as a recipient of divine benediction. That the Mughal state could be identified as highly centralized, bureaucratic, and of course one which had a long, large and very robust army. It was a unitary state par excellence, and therefore the standard by which all preceding and succeeding states were to be judged. However, what makes Akbar remarkable is his tolerance. His reign indicated an implicit acceptance at some level of the idea of theocracy, or the belief that all medieval or pre-modern states were necessarily governed by religion. So Akbar's secularism in Mughal India is definitely worth a proper look. His secular outlook was not irreligious, but was free from all traces of religious narrowness. That is why I say that theocracy in Mughal India was a theocracy, all right, but with a difference. Akbar's views on religion, as also Abul Fazl's portrayal of Akbar and his realm, created a new benchmark of tolerance and stability. All subsequent kings, particularly Aurangzeb, were measured against the yardstick of Akbar's secularism, and unfortunately they all fell short. It has been justifiably concluded by Binoy Sarkar that Abul Fazl was the precursor of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who sought to remove strife and animosity among diverse races and religious sects. He was a peacemaker and a bridge builder, whose rationality and pragmatism could not be challenged in theory, and no wonder they proved fruitful in practice. His views on communal amity went a long way in providing the Mughal state with a solid and stable foundation that evidently stood the test of time and made Akbar reach a pride of place in the annals of Indian history.